We are, as I mentioned, celebrating the 50th anniversary of Metropolitan Community Churches. Wow. Have any of you been around that long? Some of you. Some of you. There's a lot to celebrate. And this week in particular, we are honoring the role that MCC has played in the world with regard to HIV and AIDS. We're honoring and we are remembering and we are grieving our profound embodied experience of being the church with AIDS. Here in this congregation and in congregations all around the world who are using the same worship resources, thanks to the efforts of Mike Hasse and Lauren Bennett and their team, we are coming together collectively, calling to mind our memory of women and men and trans folk who have provided compassionate care to those who had no one to care for them. We're remembering what it meant, what it felt like to be inflicted with something stigmatizing that didn't have a name, and even when it did, a name that wouldn't be spoken by the highest officers of our government. We're remembering what it felt like to bury our friends, our mentors, our beloveds, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that other churches would not see or touch or acknowledge. We are remembering some very deep pain. And we are also remembering a time when we were at our best because MCC was responding to the very real needs of the world in ways that we were specifically called and uniquely equipped to do. We're remembering our protests represented by these signs. We're remembering our prophetic actions, our refusal to give in or give up. We are remembering the seasons of love and hope that have given us and so many other people inspiration and comfort and life. And so I want to tell you that my reading of this scripture passage that you heard this morning, Ezekiel in the Valley of Dry Bones, my reading of this passage has been forever and irrevocably changed by that act of remembering. My friend, many of our friends, Reverend Elder Jim Metulsky, wrote a brilliant essay about this passage in the book Take Back the Word. And in that essay, he read this passage from Ezekiel specifically from his perspective as the pastor of MCC San Francisco in the worst of the AIDS years, when he performed sometimes 500 funerals in a year. Now think about that. That's 10 funerals a week on average. And he also read this passage from his own perspective as someone who became HIV positive later when other people told him he should have known better. He reads the passage of Ezekiel, in other words, through the lens of someone overcome with the reality of AIDS, with the devastating loss of friends, lovers, an entire community, and with a burning question about what to make of all of that and where to find hope. I can't even read this passage anymore without thinking of the generation of MCC leaders that we have lost. People who died as a result of HIV/AIDS. The bones, the AIDS quilt, those things just spread out before us. I can't read this passage without that. Now, I do know that Ezekiel had his own context, at least the literary text we have, was part of an exiled people, a separated people who had been estranged and cut off and decimated. Ezekiel himself had lost so many of his friends, warriors who had been defeated in a battle for their own liberation. And I know that, as the text says, Ezekiel was taken out to the valley to survey the worst of his own experience, the worst of his community's experience. God took Ezekiel out to the valley and made him look, made him pay attention to the devastation and the loss. Didn't let him turn away or give in to distractions. God took Ezekiel out to the valley and showed him the bones. Showed him the bones of the only people he had known and loved. Made him look at exactly how awful and painful things were. And you know, doing that kind of work takes courage. It's not easy. And then God asked him a question. Basically, God said to Ezekiel, do you see any hope here? Do you see any hope here? Can these bones live? Now, the rabbis have considered this passage since forever and asked some really great questions about it. Some of those questions have pertained to the temporal elements of the story. For example, how much time did it take between God's question and Ezekiel's answer? I'm going to come back to the element of time in a moment, but suffice it to say, Ezekiel evaded God's question and answered in the way I used to answer my mother. I don't know, God, but you do. And then God, as God does still, did not answer the question. Didn't clean up the messy, didn't tie things up in a bow for Ezekiel. God simply said, prophesy. I want you to prophesy to these bones about hope. Give them a vision of a future for them, even if you cannot yet yourself imagine it. Prophesy to the bones. And Ezekiel did, and lo and behold, there arose such a clatter. I don't know how long it took, but the bones started coming together. Some sinews developed, some flesh began to appear. Ezekiel's beloved community of comrades appeared to be coming back to life. Can you imagine that joy? But there was no breath. So let me return for a moment to the question of time. I don't know how long it took for Ezekiel to answer God's question, and I don't know how long it took for Ezekiel to recognize that there was no breath, that his work was not yet complete after he had fulfilled his faithful mission already. I can imagine that he had a moment, or days, or weeks, or years of saying, whew, I did that. Me and God did some stuff. Those bones aren't scattered anymore. They're not dry. I don't know how long he reveled in the glory of those bones coming together before he realized that there was no breath. In his essay, Metelsky talked about one of the worst experiences of his own personal HIV experience, of being on a respirator for weeks, being unable to breathe on his own, hands strapped to his side. In his testimony, he says that he would drift in and out of a panicky unconsciousness and see from time to time the faces of a few friends. And he said they breathed through him with their prayers, with their touch, with their hands on his body, with their presence with him in the valley of the shadow of death. And I just want to acknowledge that our chaplains know so much about this. This is where they spend a lot of their time, breathing life into people that are in the valley, who are experiencing the lows and the highs of life, no matter who they are, and without judgment. That's where they spend their time, in that space. And this is the space, this pause is also where Ezekiel was between the time when the bones came together and the breath animated the body, when there was no breath, no life. And I think that we, like Ezekiel, are led to places where we have to face the truth, where we have to see and acknowledge the devastation that is, the pain we feel, the loss, the grief, the frustration, the hopelessness. And I think that MCC might be finding ourselves right now in this holy pause that Ezekiel was in, between celebrating some kind of movement and realizing that it is not yet complete. We have a lot to celebrate, we do. We have reanimated bones, including mine. We have seen some things knit back together. We may have developed a bit of infrastructure. Whether that's good or bad, I'm not going to say right now. We have helped progress our vision, God's vision of a radically inclusive and just world. And things are not altogether great. They're not altogether great. Our work is not done. There is still no breath in too many places. Let me name just a few to provide you some examples of what I mean. The most literal example I can think of is the cry of a black man in New York City named Eric Garner, who said, "I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe." Repeated it over and over again to the cops who held him down on the sidewalk where he died. Black men, especially in this white supremacist culture of the United States, have no breath right now. I also think of women, particularly the Me Too movement, those who've been sexually assaulted, and it's not just women, men too, trans people especially. Survivors, so many. People like perhaps Christine Blasey Ford, who come forward without enough breath to tell their stories because in their own words they are terrified and they know they won't be believed. Or perhaps they hold their breath, waiting for the next person of power to make fun of them, to belittle their courage and strength. There is no breath for too many people experiencing the reality of rape culture. I think of immigrants who hold their breath every time the doorbell rings, or they see a cop drive by, or they hear another news story about a right that's going to be restricted, or a child who is not yet reunited with their parents. There's no breath for them. And I think of the earth choking, unable to breathe because of the destruction that is brought upon it by us, humanity. The people most affected by the devastation of climate change are the least responsible for it. That is a moral dilemma, and there's no breath there. In so many situations today, there is no breath. How can we breathe when the most marginalized among us are struggling so much? We cannot. And so, MCC, friends, we still have work to do. If you ever wondered if MCC is still relevant in the world today, let me answer that question for you. Yes, we are. However, that means for us, just like it did for Ezekiel, that our work might look a little different now than it did before. Our prophecy may need to change a bit, or at least become a little more updated and focused. We did some great work in the last 50 years, prophesying to the bones. We did. We need to celebrate that. But now we have to prophesy to the breath. To the breath. 50 years of lives changed is nothing to sneeze at. Probably the lives of all of us in this very room at some point in time. And yet, our work is not done. You know, MCC has never been about just one thing. We've never been about just one thing. We are not only the gay church. We were the gay church when there wasn't one, and that was right. We are not only the lesbian church. I'm not even going to say we were that. There might have been a time we should have been that. We were the church with AIDS, and that was right. And we still are. We have not yet grown into being the trans church that we should be, or the immigrant church, or the black church, or the sex worker church, or the undocumented Latina church, or the poor church. God isn't finished with us yet, MCC. And the questions for us loom large. Do you see any hope there? Can these bones live? This question for us is an urgent one, and I hope we won't pause too long. I hope we won't stay there too long being overwhelmed before we follow God's second wave of encouragement. Prophesy to the breath. Prophesy to the breath, to the life, to the spirit that calls all people to wholeness, to community, to joy, to justice, to interdependence, to the reality and the messiness and the beauty of life. Prophesy to the breath, MCC. Prophesy to the breath. Amen. May it be so.